What if I told you that an entire chapter of human history may have been fabricated? The so-called Dark Ages, those missing centuries between the fall of Rome and the rise of the Renaissance, remain one of history's strangest puzzles. Some believe it wasn't a time of darkness at all, but perhaps the greatest cover-up in our past. Imagine for a moment that time itself could be rewritten. Imagine that the centuries we believe to have passed between the fall of Rome and the rise of medieval kingdoms were not centuries at all, but rather the invention of a handful of powerful men. This is the suggestion at the heart of what some call the phantom time hypothesis, a theory that challenges the very foundations of how we measure history. It whispers that nearly 300 years of human existence, supposedly lived between the years 614 and 911, were nothing more than shadows on parchment, illusions created by the rulers who controlled the flow of time. To most ears, such a claim sounds impossible, even absurd. Time feels solid, unshakable, bound to the movement of the stars and the turning of the earth. But when we look closely at history, at the records and the ruins, at the calendars and chronicles, unsettling gaps appear. These are not the gaps of missing pages in an old book, but the gaps of centuries in which the story of civilization seems to falter, stall, and then suddenly resume again as if waking from a long sleep. The origin of this strange idea lies in the work of a German historian, Herbert Illig, who in the 1990s proposed that our calendar is not what it seems. Illig argued that the medieval world as we know it contains phantom centuries, years that were added to the calendar by deliberate manipulation. According to him, the years 614 to 911 simply did not occur. Instead, they were fabricated, possibly by the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, his ally Pope Sylvester II, and perhaps even the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. These rulers, Illig claimed, had reasons of ambition and prestige to adjust the calendar, to bring themselves into the symbolic year of 1000, a number heavy with religious and political meaning. To do this, they extended history itself, conjuring up centuries that never were. Consider the implications of such a plot. If Illig is correct, then the grand figure of Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, the unifier of Europe, the emperor crowned in glory, may never have walked the earth. His victories, his conquests, his reforms might not be history at all, but invention. The cathedrals, the manuscripts, the chronicles of the so-called Carolingian age could be exaggerations or forgeries, written centuries later and passed off as contemporary. What we take as a cornerstone of medieval heritage may instead be a carefully constructed myth. When this theory is spoken aloud, it carries an almost dreamlike quality, as if one is stepping into an alternate world where the familiar sequence of time is no longer stable. Imagine wandering through an old medieval street and asking, did these stones truly witness the year 800? Or was that year written into existence long after the fact? The buildings do not answer. The silence of the ruins becomes a canvas upon which doubt is painted. One of Illig's central arguments rested on the Julian and Gregorian calendars. The Julian calendar, used across the Roman world, calculated the solar year slightly inaccurately, losing about 11 minutes each year. Over centuries, this small error should have accumulated into a significant drift. By the time Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian reform in 1582, the Julian calendar should have been off by roughly 13 days, if all the centuries truly passed as recorded. Instead, the correction required only 10 days. To Illig, this discrepancy was not a coincidence but a clue. It suggested, he argued, that some centuries had never occurred, that fewer years had actually passed than official history claimed. Historians, of course, responded with counter-arguments, explaining that the difference might be due to variations in how the equinox was measured, or to local adjustments in calendars. Yet the idea lingers because it plays upon something deeper than calculation. It taps into the unease we feel when confronted with the strange silence of the so-called Dark Ages. Between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and the sudden flourishing of the High Middle Ages, there lies a stretch of time that feels curiously thin. The monuments of Rome crumble into ruin, the roads fall into disrepair, and the great libraries go silent. Then suddenly we find ourselves with soaring Gothic cathedrals, universities, and chivalric knights. The centuries in between often appear like a fog, filled with fragmentary records, scarce architecture, and repeating names. Did humanity truly stumble and stagnate for hundreds of years? Or is the fog an illusion created by later writers? The figure of Charlemagne stands at the heart of this fog. He is presented as a colossus of his time, a man who united much of Western Europe, established order, and laid the groundwork for modern states. But if Charlemagne never existed, as Illig provocatively suggested, then a central pillar of European identity collapses. And what if, instead of being a historical king, Charlemagne was an idealized figure, invented by scribes working centuries later to fill a void in the narrative? The idea is unsettling because it forces us to question not only one man, but the trustworthiness of all our sources. The phantom time hypothesis also leans on the scarcity of archaeological evidence from the early Middle Ages. For a period supposedly spanning centuries, the amount of surviving material, towns, artifacts, manuscripts feels limited compared to other epochs. Of course, part of this can be explained by decline, by wars, by the fragile nature of materials. But Illig and his supporters ask, is the scarcity simply because these centuries never existed at all? The theory invites us to look again at the buildings and manuscripts we do have. Many Romanesque structures, for example, appear to spring up suddenly in the 10th century, with little transitional style before them. Manuscripts often survive in later copies, their originals missing or questionable. Could this sudden flowering be the true beginning of the Middle Ages, with earlier centuries inserted artificially? Imagine standing in a cathedral, its stones echoing with centuries of prayer. You look up at the arches, the carvings, the stained glass. Each element whispers of the passage of time, of generations who lived and died under its shadow. But then the question arises, how many of those generations truly lived? And how many were written into being to satisfy the desires of rulers who longed to shape not just their kingdoms, but time itself? The mind resists such thoughts, for to question time is to unsettle the ground beneath our feet. Time is not only how we measure days and years, it is the story of us, the thread that connects the living with the dead, the past with the present. To suggest that centuries might be missing is to suggest that the thread has been tampered with, that the fabric of history has been woven with deliberate gaps and false strands. And yet we cannot ignore the allure of the mystery. For history itself is not a fixed object but a reconstruction, pieced together from evidence, always vulnerable to the limits of what survives. The phantom time hypothesis may be dismissed by most scholars, but it reminds us of how fragile our knowledge truly is. A fire in a library, a war that destroys archives, a forgery passed as genuine. Each of these can reshape what we believe about the past. And if such small events can alter history, is it truly impossible that great rulers might have sought to alter time itself? In the quiet corridors of medieval chronicles, one name begins to shimmer with unusual significance: Otto III, Holy Roman Emperor at the turn of the first millennium. To most, he is a figure of ambition, a young man who dreamed of reviving the grandeur of Rome in the heart of medieval Europe. To Illig and those who entertain the phantom time hypothesis, Otto is something far stranger. Not simply a ruler, but an architect of time itself. Otto's reign was short, his life ending before he reached his 25th year. Yet during those years he carried a vision larger than life. He sought to fuse the authority of Rome with the sanctity of the Christian Church, declaring himself ruler of both body and soul, emperor and priest in one. He dreamed of a world reborn, a Christian empire that would rise in glory. But visions such as his require more than armies and proclamations. They require symbols, and few symbols carried greater weight in the minds of medieval people than the turning of the millennium, the year 1000. The round number was not merely mathematics. To those who gazed upon the heavens and read the scriptures, it was the threshold of prophecy, a marker heavy with divine expectation. A ruler who could preside over the year 1000 would stand as a chosen figure, one who bore the weight of destiny. But if Otto III had been born into the 7th century as Illig suggested, he would not live to see the dawn of the second millennium. So what if, instead of waiting, Otto and his allies bent time itself? What if he adjusted the calendar to place himself squarely at history's most symbolic moment? The idea, radical as it is, gains intrigue when we consider Otto's partnership with Pope Sylvester II. This pope was no ordinary cleric. Known in his youth as Gerbert of Aurillac, he had studied mathematics and astronomy, disciplines steeped in the mysteries of calculation and celestial time. He was fascinated by clocks, by the measurement of stars, by the mechanics of counting days. He was, in essence, a man who understood how fragile and flexible human reckonings of time could be. If any pope could lend credibility to a scheme that rewrote centuries, it was Sylvester II. Together, Otto III and Pope Sylvester II might have conspired with Constantine VII of Byzantium, a scholar-emperor with access to the ancient texts of the Eastern world. In this trinity of power, each figure brought something essential. Otto, the ambition to be ruler of a new Rome. Sylvester, the knowledge of calendars and astronomy. Constantine, the authority of Greek scholarship and imperial tradition. With these forces combined, they could stretch or compress history like parchment on a scribe's desk, adding centuries until the present aligned with their desires. If we follow this thread, the consequences become astonishing. Between the fall of Rome in the 5th century and Otto's day in the supposed 10th, there would be nearly 5 centuries of history. But Illig claimed that nearly 3 of those were false. In this compressed view, Otto did not live 500 years after Rome's collapse, but only 200. The ruins of Rome would not be ancient relics, but still relatively fresh scars, weathered by only a handful of generations. The dream of reviving Rome would not be a nostalgic fantasy of a distant past, but a practical continuation of a recent memory. And what of Charlemagne, the towering emperor supposedly crowned in the year 800? Illig suggested that he too may have been a fabrication of Otto's imagination, a prototype of empire created to legitimize Otto's own rule. If Europe had no ancient emperor to look back upon, then Otto would seem like a revolutionary, an upstart claiming Rome for himself. But if a figure like Charlemagne had already united the Franks and received a crown from the Pope, Otto could present himself not as an innovator but as an heir. He would be the continuation of a legacy, not its sole creator. This interpretation cast Charlemagne in a haunting new light. Was he a flesh-and-blood ruler, a warrior who fought Saxons and Lombards, who established schools and standardized weights and measures? Or was he a silhouette, drawn with ink on parchment centuries later to give substance to Otto's dream? The chronicles that describe Charlemagne's life were mostly written by clerics under royal patronage. Their loyalty to the crown was unquestioned, and their pens could shape reality as surely as swords shaped kingdoms. Could their words have given life to a king who never was? When we read the royal Frankish annals, the chronicles of Charlemagne's conquests, we often forget how fragile their survival is. Most manuscripts do not date from the time they describe, but from copies made decades or centuries later. Each copy carries not just the story of the past but the hand of the present, the potential for alteration, embellishment, even invention. In the candlelit rooms of medieval monasteries, where parchment was precious and memory was pliable, truth and fiction could easily blur. The architecture of the Carolingian age also presents puzzles. The great palace of Aachen, the so-called throne of Charlemagne, still stands as a monument to his supposed reign. Yet many scholars have noted its Roman echoes, its resemblance to late antique forms. If it were built not in the year 800 but in the 10th century, as Illig proposed, it would no longer be a pioneering medieval structure, but a direct continuation of Roman tradition. The leap from Rome to Aachen would shrink, making the building less miraculous and more understandable. Consider also the artifacts. Coins bearing Charlemagne's image exist, but coins are not immune to manipulation. They can be struck later and backdated, especially in times when control of mints was a royal prerogative. Documents survive, but medieval forgery was a thriving art, with charters and decrees often fabricated to justify land claims or privileges. If forgeries could be made for property, why not for time itself? Of course, mainstream historians dismiss these claims, pointing to continuity in language, law, and culture that suggests the centuries were real. But the gaps are there, undeniable and unsettling. Between the fall of Rome and the flowering of medieval Europe lies a twilight where the light of history grows dim. It is in this twilight that suspicion breeds. Archaeology, too, tells a curious tale. Excavations across Europe reveal flourishing Roman towns and later medieval settlements, but often the layers in between feel thinner than expected. Pottery styles, building techniques, and everyday objects seem to leap across centuries with surprising speed, as if time had hurried forward. For those who believe in phantom years, this absence is not evidence of decline but evidence of invention, an empty stretch of time that was never lived. Yet perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the phantom time hypothesis is not whether it is true but why it captures the imagination. On one level, it is a challenge to authority, a refusal to accept history as handed down by scholars and institutions. On another, it is a dream of liberation, the possibility that we might not be as far from Rome as we think, that the grandeur of antiquity is closer, more immediate, almost within reach. Imagine standing before the Colosseum in Rome, its arches scarred by centuries of wind and war. If Illig were right, those stones would not have endured 15 centuries since the gladiators, but perhaps only 12. The empire would not be a distant ghost, but a recent ancestor. Rome would not be the ruins of an unreachable past, but the fading memory of grandparents and great-grandparents. In this light, the Dark Ages dissolve like mist. They were not centuries of ignorance, but centuries of nothingness, invented to stretch the story, to create space between Rome and the present. And the question rises softly in the night air: who benefits from darkness? Who gains power by placing centuries of silence between the fall of one empire and the rise of another? The answer in the phantom time narrative is clear. It was the rulers, the emperors and popes, who gained by stepping into the year 1000. They crowned themselves at a symbolic threshold, positioning their reigns not as accidents of history, but as fulfillments of prophecy. By manipulating time, they did not merely govern their subjects. They governed the past and the future, reshaping history into a mirror of their own ambitions. Time has always been measured by the heavens. Long before kings and popes ruled over calendars, it was the stars, the moon, and the sun that gave rhythm to human life. Farmers sowed their crops by the phases of the moon, sailors set their course by constellations, and priests aligned their rituals with the rising of the sun at equinox. The sky was a clock no ruler could alter. And yet when we turn our gaze to the puzzle of the so-called Dark Ages, even the sky raises questions. The story begins with the Julian calendar, established by Julius Caesar in 45 BCE. It was a bold attempt to impose order on time itself, aligning the civil year more closely with the solar year. The Julian system declared that a year was 365.25 days long, achieved by adding a leap day every 4 years. But nature is never so easily confined. The true solar year is not 365.25 days but approximately 365.2422 days. That small difference, just 11 minutes each year, might seem trivial, but across centuries it accumulates like grains of sand in an hourglass. By the time of the early Middle Ages, this error should have become glaring. 11 minutes a year equals nearly a full day every 128 years. Over a millennium, the Julian calendar should have slipped by roughly 8 full days. By the 1500s, when the Gregorian reform was introduced, the drift should have been closer to 13 days. But here lies the puzzle. When Pope Gregory XIII corrected the calendar in 1582, he ordered 10 days to be dropped. The Julian date of October 4th was immediately followed by the Gregorian date of October 15th. Not 13 days, not 8, 10. To most historians, this difference is not mysterious. They argue that the equinox was measured differently in ancient Rome, or that the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, which established rules for calculating Easter, may have relied on approximations. Variations in how people observe the skies, they say, explain the discrepancy, but for Illig and those drawn to the phantom time hypothesis, this correction is evidence of something more startling: centuries missing from history. If only 10 days of drift were corrected, then perhaps fewer centuries had truly passed than official history claims. Perhaps instead of 1,600 years separating Julius Caesar's calendar from Gregory XIII's reform, there were only about 1/300. In other words, around 300 years of phantom time had been added to the record. The numbers, once seen this way, no longer align with the accepted story, but with Illig's claim. Consider how fragile our reckoning of time is. The measurement of an equinox is not like the ticking of a machine but an observation made by human eyes. Clouds, instruments, and even the place of observation could alter the results. Yet entire calendars were adjusted on the basis of these observations. A small error could ripple through centuries, and when we stand at the edge of these uncertainties, we begin to wonder, was the calendar shaped by mistakes or by deliberate design? The heavens themselves offer another layer of evidence. Astronomical records, eclipses, comets, conjunctions of planets, serve as anchors in the stream of time. Unlike chronicles, which can be altered by human hands, the motions of the stars follow laws indifferent to kings and scribes. If an eclipse is said to have occurred in the year 763, modern astronomers can calculate whether such an eclipse was visible then and where. Many ancient records do indeed match astronomical events, lending credibility to traditional chronology, but some do not. A handful of medieval eclipse accounts fall into periods where no such eclipse should have been visible, or where their descriptions better match events from different centuries. For the supporters of phantom time, these mismatches are tantalizing clues. They suggest that scribes may have backdated or misplaced events into phantom centuries. The sky becomes a witness, silent but unyielding, exposing the frailty of written records. If even one major astronomical event is misdated by centuries, how can we be certain of the timeline we accept? And yet the problem is not so simple. The recording of astronomical events in the past was not as precise as it is today. Descriptions of eclipses, for instance, could be vague, mistaking a partial eclipse for a total one, or exaggerating its darkness as a sign from heaven. Comets, too, were often given symbolic meanings rather than scientific descriptions, and their appearances could be confused across generations. So the astronomical evidence remains a battlefield of interpretation. For most historians, the mismatches are simply errors of description. For believers in phantom years, they are cracks in the edifice of official time. The Council of Nicaea, held in 325 CE, adds another layer to the mystery. This gathering of bishops under Emperor Constantine the Great established the rules for calculating the date of Easter, one of the most important feasts in the Christian calendar. The decision was tied to the vernal equinox, fixed as March 21st. By the 16th century, when Gregory reformed the calendar, the equinox had drifted to March 11th, that is, 10 days earlier. If more than 1,000 years had truly passed since Nicaea, the drift should have been greater, closer to 13 days. The fact that it was only 10 seems to suggest that fewer centuries had actually elapsed. Imagine, then, that the rulers of the early second millennium were aware of this discrepancy. If Otto III wished to place himself in the symbolic year 1000, the calendar's inconsistency would be both a problem and an opportunity. By adjusting history, by inserting phantom centuries, he could align his reign with the sacred threshold of prophecy. With the help of Pope Sylvester II, master of astronomical lore, he could make the heavens appear to confirm his authority. Time, after all, is not only a scientific measurement, but a story we tell about ourselves. If the story is convincing, who would question it? The phantom time hypothesis pushes us to imagine this possibility, that the timeline of the world is not a river flowing smoothly, but a tapestry, woven and rewoven by human hands. In one version of the tapestry, centuries of darkness stretch between Rome and the High Middle Ages. In another, those centuries vanish, leaving a shorter, sharper story, where Rome's fall and Europe's rebirth are separated by only a few generations. But if this were so, why do we not notice? Why do the stars not cry out? The answer lies in the nature of human perception. We do not live long enough to witness the slow drift of calendars. Each generation trusts the reckoning of the one before, accepting the dates written in chronicles, the festivals marked on calendars, the eclipses predicted by priests. A manipulation of centuries would pass unnoticed by ordinary people, felt only in the symbols of rulers and the silence of archives. The leap from Julian to Gregorian time is, in itself, a haunting reminder of how flexible history can be. In one moment, October 4th, 1582 existed. In the next, the world awoke to October 15th. 10 days vanished from the lives of millions. People went to bed on a Thursday and woke on a Friday, their birthdays shifted, their memories displaced. If 10 days can disappear by decree, why not centuries by conspiracy? For most of us, such ideas stir unease rather than belief. The mind resists the notion that time could be altered so profoundly, and yet the fact remains that time as we measure it is not absolute. It is a system built from observation, calculation, and agreement. When rulers and priests possess the authority to declare what year it is, they wield not only power over the present, but power over the past. They can anchor themselves in prophecy, align themselves with destiny, and declare themselves chosen. This is the quiet danger that lingers within the calendar problem. It is not only a question of numbers, of 10 days or 13, of minutes gained or lost. It is the recognition that time is not immune to manipulation. The heavens may be constant, but the stories we tell about them are not. And in the candle-lit halls of medieval courts, where ambition burned brighter than truth, who can say what stories were woven into the fabric of history? So we are left with a choice. Do we trust the explanations of scholars, who argue that the difference between 10 and 13 days can be accounted for by imprecise ancient observations? Or do we entertain the possibility that those missing days point to something deeper, something stranger, a hole in the fabric of time itself, where centuries may have slipped into existence not by living but by decree? The calendar stands before us as both a guide and a riddle, Its numbers march forward, marking years we can never revisit, centuries we can never touch. Yet hidden within those numbers may lie a cover-up so vast that it redefines history. And as the stars wheel silently overhead, we cannot help but wonder, did the heavens witness 3 extra centuries? Or are those centuries only shadows, phantoms written into the pages of time? The deeper we look into this supposed cover-up, the more we begin to see that it is not a simple matter of missing scrolls or burned books, but rather a story of who controlled the narrative of history, who was allowed to record it, and who was silenced. In every empire, in every kingdom, the keepers of knowledge were not neutral scribes but active participants in shaping how future generations would see the past. If the Dark Ages were dark, perhaps they were made so deliberately, as power shifted from the remnants of Rome to the rising influence of the Church, from local tribes carving their identity out of chaos to monarchies just beginning to consolidate their rule. And here lies the paradox. While many accounts claim that nothing happened in these centuries, in truth everything was happening: wars, migrations, discoveries, inventions, trade routes forming and collapsing, languages evolving. But those events were not written with the same grandeur as Roman triumphs or Greek philosophies. They were recorded in the margins of monastic texts, whispered in sagas or hidden in oral traditions passed down from generation to generation. What if the darkness was not the absence of activity, but the deliberate absence of recognition? By naming this period dark, later historians cast a shadow over it, making it appear as a void when in fact it was the seedbed of the modern world. Consider how knowledge itself was curated. Monks who painstakingly copied manuscripts did not preserve every text. They chose which works were worth saving and which should fade into silence. Entire libraries could vanish not by fire but by neglect, as parchment was scraped clean to make room for prayers instead of poetry, theology instead of philosophy. Imagine how many voices were lost not because they never spoke, but because someone decided their words did not deserve to echo through time. Could it be that the cover-up was not a single act but a quiet, centuries-long process of filtering history until only certain threads remained? The label of the Dark Ages also serves a psychological function for later ages. Renaissance thinkers, hungry to glorify their own rebirth, cast the centuries before them as barren, as if to heighten their own brilliance by contrast. Enlightenment scholars, too, perpetuated the idea that reason had been asleep, smothered by superstition, until they awoke it. Thus the so-called Dark Ages became a convenient backdrop, a foil against which future eras could shine. But in doing so, they erased the complexity of those centuries, turning living, breathing societies into little more than a blank space between Rome and the Renaissance. When we peel back this distortion, the question grows larger. If one era could be painted so falsely, how many others have been reshaped, rebranded, or obscured to serve a narrative? What truths lie hidden beneath the sweeping labels we attach to history? And how much of what we know is merely the product of someone else's story? Carefully chosen, carefully edited? The Dark Ages, then, might not be a cover-up of events themselves, but a cover-up of memory, a decision about what humanity was allowed to remember, and what it was instructed to forget. If we step into the silence of a monastery in the 7th century, we might hear the scratching of quills across parchment. The monk bends over a dimly lit desk, laboring not to create new ideas but to preserve fragments of a world already fading. Yet even here, preservation was not neutral. He chose what to copy. Augustine's sermons, not the poems of Ovid, theological treatises, not practical manuals on Roman engineering. By his hand and the hands of thousands like him, the shape of the past was pruned. It is not that the ancient world disappeared entirely, it was selectively remembered. This was not destruction but filtration, a slow narrowing of the lens through which future generations would view their inheritance. And outside the monastery walls, life thrived, though in forms unfamiliar to the Roman chroniclers. Farmers experimented with new plows that cut deeper into the earth. Villages grew into proto-towns as trade routes stretched across rivers and forests. Languages split and flowered, weaving the patchwork of dialects that would one day become French, German, English, and Italian. Yet because these changes were not celebrated in marble or etched into imperial inscriptions, they were treated as invisible. The cover-up was not that nothing happened, but that what happened did not fit the narrative of civilization defined by Rome and later by the Renaissance. The greatest irony is this. Many of the so-called dark innovations were precisely what allowed Europe to climb out of obscurity and into dominance. Without the agricultural experiments of those centuries, the population boom of the later Middle Ages could never have occurred. Without the preservation of even fragments of ancient knowledge by monks, there would have been nothing for Renaissance scholars to rediscover. Without the slow organic growth of feudalism, there would have been no political soil for monarchies and eventually nation-states to rise. To call it dark is to cover up its foundational role in the story of the modern world. Why then persist with the label? Because labels shape perception and perception shapes power. The Renaissance claimed to be a rebirth of what? Of classical learning, of art, of reason. But for a rebirth to be glorious, there must first be death, a void, a womb of darkness from which light emerges. The Dark Ages served that role not as truth, but as a rhetorical device. By blackening out centuries, Renaissance scholars cast themselves as saviors of knowledge. And by repeating their words later, historians reinforced the illusion. Thus, the cover-up was perpetuated not by a single conspiracy, but by the momentum of narrative itself. When we begin to untangle this, we realize how fragile the story of history truly is. Imagine if different texts had been preserved, if pagan poems and scientific treatises had been valued alongside scripture. Imagine if chronicles of common life had been written with the same zeal as royal decrees. The past would look far brighter, far richer, far more continuous. Instead, we inherited a dimly lit corridor, with just enough flickering candles to guide us while vast chambers remain hidden in shadow. Charlemagne stands in history like a colossus. He is the emperor who unified much of Europe after the collapse of Rome, the warrior who crushed his enemies, the patron of learning who launched a renaissance, the man later called Pater Europae, the father of Europe. His figure towers over the so-called Dark Ages, casting the light of order, culture, and empire upon centuries that otherwise appear shrouded in chaos. But when we look closer, when we examine the records not as monuments of truth but as crafted narratives, we begin to see cracks in the marble image. Could it be that the mighty Charlemagne we know is not the man who lived, but the creation of scribes, monks, and kings who needed him to be larger than life? Could his story be less about a flesh-and-blood ruler and more about the myth of power itself? When Rome fell, Europe fractured into countless pieces. Tribes migrated, kingdoms rose and fell, warlords ruled over broken provinces. For centuries there was no single unifying figure, no Caesar, no Augustus. Then suddenly we are told Charlemagne appeared, a Frankish king whose sword cut through division, whose crown bound disparate peoples together, whose authority stretched from the Pyrenees to the Danube, from the North Sea to the Italian boot. But the earliest accounts of his reign come not from neutral observers, but from those who served him or his heirs. Einhard, his famous biographer, wrote not as a detached historian but as a courtier who owed his life and career to the emperor's patronage. Every glowing description, every tale of wisdom and conquest must be read with that in mind. Was Einhard recording the man as he was, or the man as he needed to be remembered? The further we dig, the more questions arise. Charlemagne could not write, at least not fluently. His empire, though vast, was stitched together by fragile oaths, constant warfare and the threat of collapse. Yet he is credited with creating schools, reviving Latin, standardizing law, even igniting the Carolingian Renaissance. How much of this was his personal vision, and how much was the work of anonymous clerics later attributed to him to give the illusion of a great guiding hand? For every innovation credited to Charlemagne, there is evidence it emerged from the collective effort of monks, bishops, and scholars scattered across Europe. But history loves a face, and so the work of many became the glory of one. And then there is the question of invention. Some historians whisper of the possibility that certain details of his reign, his legendary conquests, his just rulings, his image as a new David chosen by God, were amplified beyond recognition. The coronation story itself, in which Pope Leo III crowned him emperor in the year 800, may not have unfolded as magnificently as later accounts suggest. Did Charlemagne kneel humbly before the Pope, or was the crown placed on his head against his will? Was this a moment of divine providence or a carefully staged theater of legitimacy? The records differ, and what remains is the version that best served both throne and altar. An emperor chosen by God, ruling by divine right, sanctioned by the Church. It is almost too perfect, too symbolic to be anything but political art. If we think of Charlemagne as a man, we see a warrior king who fought endless wars, who expanded territory through blood and steel, who forced conversions upon conquered peoples at the point of the sword. The Saxons, in particular, were subjected to brutal campaigns that lasted decades, where refusal to accept baptism could mean death. This side of Charlemagne, the ruthless conqueror, the bringer of fire as well as faith, is often muted in the glowing chronicles. Instead, the scribes highlight his piety, his support of learning, his wisdom. They paint him as Solomon reborn, a new Constantine, even a Christ-like shepherd of his flock. Is this balance of image an accident, or was it deliberate manipulation? Legends grew quickly around him. Tales of Charlemagne battling giants, journeying to the Holy Land, wielding a sword named Joyeuse, began to circulate. Some were born centuries later, in the epic Song of Roland, where his campaigns against Muslims in Spain were transformed into stories of holy war. Here the historical king dissolves entirely into myth, a template for Christian rulers who sought to frame their battles as sacred struggles. Charlemagne the Emperor became Charlemagne the saintly warrior, a patron of crusades that he never fought, a prophet of wars waged long after his death. This layering of legend upon fact created a shadow so vast it swallowed the real man. But perhaps the greatest exaggeration is his very uniqueness. The narrative tells us Charlemagne alone brought order to Europe. Yet archaeological evidence suggests that long before his reign, regions were already stabilizing, trade routes reopening, cultures flourishing in small but steady ways. The Mediterranean never ceased to be a highway of commerce. The British Isles, Scandinavia, and even Central Europe were evolving with or without Frankish intervention. Charlemagne did not so much create a civilization from darkness as he inherited and consolidated fragments already taking shape. By presenting him as the sole architect of rebirth, later chroniclers created a simple story: chaos, then Charlemagne, then progress. It is clean, compelling, and misleading. Why would such exaggeration be useful? Power always seeks legitimacy. Kingship, especially in the fragile centuries after Rome's fall, required not just armies but myths. By elevating Charlemagne, his heirs could claim descent from a near mythical figure, granting their thrones the aura of destiny. The Church, too, benefited from this narrative. By portraying Charlemagne as the obedient son of Rome, crowned by the Pope himself, the Church reinforced its own authority. No king ruled without God's blessing, mediated through the hands of priests. The story of Charlemagne was not merely history, It was propaganda woven into the very fabric of Europe's identity. And here we return to the idea of cover-up. If Charlemagne's image was exaggerated, what was concealed in the process? Perhaps the contributions of countless nameless figures, the craftsmen who built roads and churches, the monks who preserved texts, the traders who carried goods across seas, the peasants whose toil sustained kingdoms. Their story was buried under the weight of a single man's legend. Perhaps, too, the brutality of his wars, the fragility of his empire, the fact that his grand creation fractured almost immediately after his death. These were covered up by the golden paint of memory. We see the crown, but not the cracks. Even the name Charlemagne speaks to this construction. His given name was Karl or Charles. The title Magnus, the Great, was added later, just as Alexander and Constantine had been called the Great. It is a label that transforms a mortal into a monument. But who decides greatness? Those who hold the pen, not those who hold the plow or the sword. His greatness, then, is as much the creation of writers as it is the measure of his deeds. The shadow of Charlemagne stretches far beyond his lifetime. Centuries later, the Holy Roman emperors invoked his memory to justify their authority. French kings called themselves his heirs. Napoleon, in crowning himself emperor, wrapped himself in Charlemagne's mantle. Even Adolf Hitler claimed to continue the work of Charlemagne in uniting Europe under a single banner. The myth endured long after the man was gone, shaping politics and dreams alike. But every time his name was used, the image grew further from reality, until it became impossible to separate fact from fable. So who was Charlemagne? A king, certainly, who ruled over a powerful Frankish realm, who expanded territory through conquest, who fostered learning within his court. But also a construct, magnified by the pens of loyal scribes, sanctified by the church, immortalized in legend. His true face may be forever hidden, obscured beneath centuries of glorification. What we know of him may be less the man himself and more the shadow he cast, a shadow so carefully drawn that it became indistinguishable from the truth. And so, Charlemagne's shadow is not just his legacy, it is a mirror reflecting how history itself is shaped. Facts blur into stories, stories harden into myths, myths calcify into identity. What begins as memory becomes monument, and monuments can conceal as much as they reveal. The greatest cover-up of the so-called Dark Ages may not be the absence of knowledge, but the invention of certainty where there was none. And Charlemagne, the mighty emperor, may be the most brilliant invention of them all. There is something unsettling about walking through the corridor of history and finding whole centuries dimly lit, with only a handful of flickering candles to guide the way. When we pass from the glory of Rome with its aqueducts, amphitheaters, marble cities, and intricate road networks into the early medieval centuries, the landscape seems to go quiet. We see scattered ruins of a civilization that once dominated the known world, and then, not much. No new Colosseum, no fresh Pantheon, no libraries of Alexandria rising again in stone. Instead, for nearly 500 years we are told there is little evidence of major innovation, monumental architecture, or cultural flowering. It is as though humanity itself had pressed pause, the great march of civilization arrested in silence. But can human creativity truly sleep for so long? Or is it possible that the appearance of stillness was crafted, a cover-up born of erasure, neglect, or deliberate manipulation? To imagine progress disappearing is to imagine the human spirit itself being shackled. For thousands of years before, even in times of war and famine, cultures created. The Egyptians raised pyramids. The Mesopotamians built ziggurats. The Greeks etched their philosophies into stone. The Romans spread their engineering marvels across continents. Yet the centuries that followed Rome's collapse appear strangely barren. The ruins of aqueducts remained, but few were repaired. Amphitheaters stood as empty shells. their stones scavenged to build huts. The roads that once connected an empire were left to weeds and weather. Architecture of the grand scale dwindled into the modest timber halls of warlords and the simple chapels of monks. To later historians, this void became proof of regression, a cultural silence, a sleep of centuries. But is it truly silence? Or is it the kind of silence that comes not from absence but from the suppression of sound? The narrative of missing progress may itself be a construction, a story told by those who wanted to portray these centuries as dark, barren, and stagnant. Renaissance scholars, eager to glorify their own rebirth of knowledge, found it convenient to look back and declare that nothing of worth had been achieved since Rome. Enlightenment thinkers, eager to champion reason over faith, painted the medieval centuries as superstition's long night. In both cases, the past was not recorded as it was lived, but as it served a rhetorical purpose. If no great innovations were remembered, it may be because they were not acknowledged, not valued, or not copied down by the people who had the power to preserve memory. Consider how fragile the survival of knowledge is. A manuscript might exist in only a handful of copies, each one written by hand on fragile parchment. A fire, a flood, a raid, or the whim of a censor could erase it forever. A building could stand for centuries, but if its stones were dismantled for other projects, its memory might vanish with it. Progress is not only what is created, it is also what is remembered. And if the keepers of memory decided that certain creations did not matter, then they might as well have never existed. This raises the haunting possibility that innovations, cultural works, even architectural marvels may have bloomed in the early medieval centuries, only to vanish without trace because they were not considered worthy of survival. The silence, then, may be less a pause in human progress and more a cover-up of human diversity. Yet traces remain if one looks closely. The heavy plow developed in these centuries revolutionized agriculture, allowing deeper cultivation in the thick soils of northern Europe. The horse collar, another seemingly modest invention, dramatically increased the efficiency of farming and transport. Water mills and windmills spread, quietly powering Europe's economy in ways far more transformative than a single grand amphitheater. But because these were not monumental structures, because they did not glitter like marble temples or rise like stone cathedrals, they were dismissed as minor, barely worthy of record. And so the myth of missing progress was born. Perhaps the greatest irony is that these so-called dark centuries laid the very groundwork for the explosive growth of the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Without these quiet, practical innovations, the future could not have flourished. Still, the question lingers. Why do we have so few records? Why do the centuries between Rome and the High Middle Ages feel like a long shadow across the past? One answer lies in deliberate erasure. As Christianity became the dominant force in Europe, it redefined what was worthy of preservation. Pagan temples were not only abandoned but often destroyed or converted into churches. Philosophical works that did not align with Christian doctrine were sometimes suppressed or neglected. Scribes chose which texts to copy, and their choices reshaped the intellectual inheritance of the West. By prioritizing theology over science, hagiography over history, sermons over secular literature, they created a record that emphasized faith while obscuring the wider spectrum of human thought. What did not fit was allowed to fade. Another answer lies in the collapse of centralized authority. Rome had been a machine for recording itself. Every law, every battle, every triumph etched into stone, carved into monuments, preserved in sprawling archives. When Rome fell, so too did this bureaucratic machinery. Local lords had little reason to maintain vast archives. Their power rested on land, not memory. Their victories were celebrated in oral sagas, not marble inscriptions. This shift from written monumental culture to oral localized culture created an illusion of silence. The progress was there, but it was whispered, not shouted, sung in mead halls rather than inscribed in stone. Later ages, hungry for documentation, mistook the lack of written records for a lack of activity. And perhaps the silence also reflects the trauma of collapse. Imagine living in the shadow of Rome, a civilization that seemed eternal only to see it unravel. For generations, people may have looked not forward, but backward, scavenging the ruins of greatness rather than building new monuments. Survival became the priority. Progress turned inward, toward sustaining life, stabilizing communities, finding new rhythms in a fragmented world. In such times, grand innovation may have seemed a luxury. This too may explain why progress appeared to stall, not because humanity had lost the capacity to create, but because the conditions of chaos redirected that capacity toward endurance rather than spectacle. And yet, the myth of missing progress persists, because it serves a story. To say there was a pause makes the Renaissance appear as a sudden blaze of genius, a miracle after centuries of darkness. It flatters the idea of rebirth, suggesting that only in Florence, only in the age of Leonardo and Michelangelo, did humanity awaken again. But the truth may be subtler. The Renaissance was not a miraculous rebirth, but the flowering of seeds planted in centuries long dismissed as barren. Those centuries were not a pause, but a gestation. The mills, the plows, the monasteries copying texts, the slow spread of literacy, the survival of cities in Italy and Byzantium, all these were the roots that fed the sudden bloom of culture in the 15th century. To call them dark is to cover up the soil from which the light eventually sprang. So we return to the question, did humanity pause, or were the records erased? The answer may be both. Progress did not halt, but its form shifted. Its records were filtered and its memory was reframed. What appears as silence may be the quiet hum of unseen labor, the kind that does not leave monuments but leaves legacies. And the erasures, whether deliberate suppression by religious authorities, neglect by local rulers, or the accidents of time, created gaps that later ages filled with their own narratives. The cover-up was not of history itself, but of history's complexity. A vibrant, multifaceted era was flattened into a void, so that later generations could more easily cast themselves as saviors of culture. Perhaps this is the greatest lesson of the so-called missing progress. History is not simply what happened, but what is remembered. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It is evidence of choices. Choices about what to preserve, what to destroy, what to ignore. Somewhere in the ashes of forgotten manuscripts, in the stones of dismantled buildings, in the unrecorded inventions of peasants and artisans, lie the true stories of these centuries. They may never be fully recovered, but their ghostly presence challenges the myth of darkness. The silence is not empty. It is filled with echoes we have not yet learned to hear. And so the dark ages may not have been dark at all, but dimly lit, their glow obscured by the glare of later centuries claiming the spotlight. Progress was not missing, it was simply hidden, erased, or overlooked. To believe otherwise is to accept the cover-up, to surrender to the illusion of a pause in the human story. The truth is more haunting and perhaps more beautiful. Humanity never stopped moving forward. We simply forgot how to see it. Time is the invisible stage upon which all history unfolds, yet even time itself can be manipulated. We like to believe that the ticking of the clock, the rising of the sun, the turning of the seasons are eternal and fixed, immune to the biases of human will. But calendars are not the sky. They are agreements, systems crafted by human hands to measure what the heavens reveal. And where there are agreements, there is power. Where there is power, there is manipulation. The shift from the Julian calendar, devised under Julius Caesar, to the Gregorian calendar introduced by Pope Gregory XIII in 1582, was more than a technical correction. It was a rewriting of time itself, and it left centuries of confusion in its wake. Some whisper that these adjustments may not have merely corrected the drift of days, but may have concealed or even fabricated years. If true, then the greatest cover-up of all may not be a hidden text or a destroyed monument, but the manipulation of time itself. The Julian calendar, introduced in 46 BCE, was already a marvel of reform. Rome had inherited a chaotic system of lunar reckonings, corrupted by political tampering and out of sync with the solar year. Caesar, advised by astronomers from Alexandria, imposed a calendar of 365 days with a leap year every 4 years. It was elegant, simple, and enduring, but it was not perfect. The solar year is not exactly 365.25 days. It is about 11 minutes shorter. That tiny difference seems trivial, but over centuries it accumulates. By the Middle Ages, the Julian calendar had drifted by nearly 10 days. Festivals tied to the equinox, especially Easter, no longer matched the heavens. The Church, which claimed dominion not only over souls but over the rhythm of sacred time, could not allow such disorder to continue. Thus came the Gregorian reform. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII decreed a new calendar, one that dropped 10 days from October of that year to realign the seasons. Thursday, October 4th was followed immediately by Friday, October 15th. Leap year rules were adjusted. Not every fourth year would be a leap year, only those divisible by 4, except for centuries not divisible by 400. It was a clever fix, bringing the civil year into closer harmony with the solar year, yet it raised profound questions. If 10 days could vanish by decree, what else could be erased or added by the powers that claimed authority over time? For most, the reform was confusing but necessary. But some historians and skeptics began to wonder, what if the adjustments masked larger manipulations? What if entire years had been invented, slipped into the record, or lost in transition? This speculation is sometimes called the phantom time hypothesis. It suggests that certain centuries, particularly between the years 600 and 900 CE, may never have existed at all. According to this theory, the period we call the early Middle Ages, what some call the Dark Ages, was a phantom, created by calendar errors or deliberate falsification. If true, then figures like Charlemagne may be not just exaggerated legends but fabrications of chronology itself. At first glance, this idea seems absurd. How could centuries be invented? Yet when we look at the nature of records in those times, the idea becomes less impossible. Few people could read or write. Most historical documents were preserved only in monasteries. Chronologies were maintained not by global networks of astronomers but by local clerics, each relying on copies of copies, each vulnerable to error. In such a world, the manipulation of dates, whether by mistake or design, could ripple outward, reshaping entire centuries. And when later reformers like Gregory adjusted the calendar, the gaps and errors might have been smoothed over, cementing the illusion. One of the strangest aspects of the phantom time hypothesis is its link to architectural and archaeological puzzles. Supporters point out that in some regions of Europe, there is little material evidence for the years said to lie between 600 and 900. Towns seem not to grow. Coins are scarce, written records are thin. Was this a true decline, or was it a sign that those centuries never existed? The Gregorian reform, by redefining the very structure of the year, could have concealed or legitimized this chronological gap, covering up the fact that time itself had been bent. If 10 days could be erased in 1582, why not 3 centuries earlier? The motives, too, are worth considering. Why might rulers or clerics wish to alter the calendar? One answer is legitimacy. A king who wished to claim descent from Rome might find it useful to shift the chronology, placing himself closer to the Caesars. A pope seeking to emphasize his authority might benefit from redefining sacred time, anchoring feasts to his decrees rather than to the unpredictable stars. Even small changes could accumulate into profound distortions, and once written, once copied, once preached from the pulpit, the dates became reality. For most people, time was not measured by astronomy but by the church bell, the market day, the cycle of planting and harvest. If the calendar said it was the year 800, who would dispute it? Skeptics argue that astronomy itself disproves such theories. Eclipses, they say, can be dated with precision, and medieval chronicles describe eclipses that match the modern calculations. But even here there are uncertainties. Chronicles are vague, eclipses can be partial, and records are often written long after the events. What if the chroniclers too retrofitted their dates to match the official calendar? The line between observation and record is never as firm as we imagine. Time, as history remembers it, is not the raw sky but the written account of the sky, and accounts can be altered. The Gregorian reform, then, is a reminder that time is not simply measured, it is controlled. By erasing days, the Church asserted its power not only over faith but over existence itself. Imagine going to bed on October 4th and waking to October 15th. 10 days of your life gone forever. Birthdays, debts, contracts, even lives might vanish in that gap. The people who lived through it must have felt disoriented, unmoored. Their very reality reshaped by decree. If this could happen in 1582, why not earlier? Why not on a larger scale? The manipulation of calendars is not just a technical matter. It is an act of sovereignty, a declaration of who defines reality. And yet, even if the phantom centuries are a myth, the suspicion they raise is revealing. It reminds us that history is not a natural flow but a constructed one. Calendars are inventions. Years are names we give to cycles. The truth of lived time, the rising and setting of the sun, the growing and withering of crops, the aging of the body, remains constant. But the stories we attach to those cycles are malleable. If those stories can be shifted, entire civilizations can be made to appear older, younger, or altogether different. The Dark Ages may have been dark not because nothing happened, but because the light of chronology was dimmed, refracted, bent into shapes that suited power. The Gregorian reform, in correcting the drift of days, also cemented centuries of distortion. Whether by accident or design, it created the illusion of continuity, smoothing over gaps, hiding the possibility that some years may never have existed. It is a chilling thought that the very bedrock of history, time itself, may be less stable than we believe. What then is the lesson of the manipulated calendars? Perhaps it is that history is never just about what happened, but about how we count what happened. Dates are not neutral, they are decisions, agreements, sometimes even deceptions. And if the flow of years can be bent, then so too can the story of humanity. In the end, whether the phantom time hypothesis is true or false, it serves as a reminder of the fragility of our timeline. The past may not be lost in shadow, it may be bent, reshaped, or even invented, hidden in the folds of a calendar that was never as precise as we imagined. Time, like history, is a story we tell ourselves. And sometimes the story is not the truth but the cover-up. Walk through the ruins of ancient Rome and you cannot help but feel the weight of continuity. The aqueducts stretch across valleys, their arches standing defiant against centuries of weather. Amphitheaters rise like fossilized skeletons of entertainment, silent yet imposing. The stone-paved roads, worn smooth by legions, still whisper of commerce and conquest. Step further back into Greece and the temples of marble endure, their columns fractured yet recognizable, their ideals carved into permanence. Even older, The pyramids of Egypt pierce the sky, weathering millennia yet refusing to vanish. These civilizations, separated by centuries, left physical anchors that reassure us of their existence. Yet when we move into the period known as the Dark Ages, the landscape shifts into a strange quiet. The ruins remain, but they belong to an earlier world. Between the echoes of Rome and the grandeur of medieval cathedrals lies a gap, a silence in stone and parchment, in the debris of human endeavor. It is this silence that fuels suspicion. For a stretch of centuries, from roughly the 6th to the 10th, we find ourselves standing in a desert of evidence. There are churches, yes, but modest ones compared to the basilicas of Rome or the soaring Gothic marvels of later centuries. There are castles, but most are wooden palisades that leave behind little more than traces in the soil. Pottery shards exist, but far fewer than in the bustling marketplaces of Greece or Rome. Written records survive, but they are sparse, repetitive, and often copied centuries after the events they supposedly describe. This absence of material culture invites unsettling questions. Did humanity pause, struck dumb and stagnant for centuries? Or did something else occur? Something more deliberate, a manipulation, an erasure that cut out swathes of history like a censor's hand across a manuscript? Archaeology thrives on material witnesses. Coins, for instance, are among the most reliable markers of time, stamped with rulers' names and faces, often in high circulation. Yet in the Dark Ages, coinage becomes oddly inconsistent. Entire decades pass with little evidence of minting. Archaeologists find coins attributed to rulers who are scarcely mentioned in any chronicle, and sometimes the reverse. Grand figures in chronicles for whom no coins can be found. Were the presses truly so quiet? Or have the products of their labor been lost to some unexplained void? Pottery, too, normally offers archaeologists a dense record of daily life, its fragments scattered across ancient kitchens and refuse heaps. Yet Dark Age pottery is curiously scarce. We know people still ate, drank, cooked, and stored food, but where is the debris? Where are the broken shards that should carpet the archaeological record? The ground refuses to speak clearly, leaving silence where chatter should be. Buildings offer a similar riddle. When Rome collapsed, its cities did not all simply vanish. People continued to live among the ruins. Yet instead of building new stone structures, many communities dismantled the old, repurposing bricks and columns to create humble shelters. The grandeur of empire gave way to a patchwork of recycled fragments. Archaeologists find abundant signs of spoliation. Columns pulled from temples, statues toppled and recarved, stones stripped and reset into crude walls. The result is not absence, but a strange recycling that obscures origins. It is as if the memory of Rome was both clung to and erased, embraced in practicality but denied in spirit. Yet this very act muddies the archaeological record. When we dig, what we find is not new creation but reused echoes, which makes it difficult to place events in precise sequence. The silence deepens not because there is nothing, but because the evidence has been scrambled. Documents add another layer of mystery. Where ancient Greece and Rome teem with letters, plays, histories, and treatises, the Dark Ages offer only a handful of chronicles, mostly written by monks and mostly retrospective. These are not the voices of bustling marketplaces or the chatter of private correspondence. They are filtered, controlled, and above all selective. Entire regions vanish from written memory, as though no one thought to record their existence. Even when documents exist, their survival is patchy. Vast libraries were lost in fires, wars, or neglect. The great library of Alexandria had already fallen, but its shadow looms over this silence, reminding us how fragile human memory can be. Was this loss accidental? The slow erosion of ink and parchment, or was it convenient for rulers who wished to shape history to their design? A gap in evidence is also an opportunity for invention. If few records survive, then later scribes can write almost anything into the void, and it will pass as truth. Some scholars point to climate and disease as explanations. The 6th century witnessed the Justinian plague, a pandemic that killed millions. Entire cities shrank. Agricultural lands fell fallow. The climate itself shifted, with volcanic eruptions blotting the sky and ushering in a little ice age. Under these conditions, progress slowed. People built less, traded less, recorded less. Archaeological silence, then, could be the natural result of survival taking precedence over creativity. This explanation soothes the mystery but does not resolve it. Even in times of hardship, humans leave behind traces. Refugees carry their belongings. Survivors scratch notes, carve marks, adapt. Yet the Dark Ages yield so little compared to both earlier and later periods that one wonders if more than hardship is at play. Consider burial sites. In the Roman world, tombs were abundant, often inscribed, often decorated. In the Middle Ages proper, graves multiplied, marked by stone churches and cemeteries. Yet Dark Age burials are less plentiful, less monumental. In some regions, entire populations seem to vanish from the earth, leaving behind only whispers of bone. Archaeologists have puzzled over this, asking if burial practices changed, if cremation left fewer remains, if wooden markers rotted away. Each possibility explains part but not the whole. The silence persists. It feels as though we are peering into a play where entire acts are missing. The stage empty, the actors absent, only the curtain swaying as if someone has just left. The silence, ironically, makes space for theories as bold as the phantom time hypothesis. If evidence is scarce, then perhaps centuries were fabricated. If archaeology cannot produce layers of growth between the fall of Rome and the rise of the High Middle Ages, then perhaps those centuries never truly existed. Critics call this fanciful, and perhaps it is, but the silence itself nurtures the possibility, giving conspiracy its soil. Without artifacts, without buildings, without records, doubt blossoms easily. Skepticism feeds on gaps, and the Dark Ages are full of them. And yet silence need not mean absence. It can mean transformation, movement beyond detection. Wooden fortresses leave little trace compared to stone. Oral traditions vanish unless written down, yet they may have thrived as the true carriers of culture. Marketplaces leave behind few ruins, yet they may have pulsed with life. The silence could be an illusion, born of our reliance on certain types of evidence. Perhaps the Dark Ages were not dark at all, but simply opaque to the methods we favor. Archaeology digs for stone and ceramic, but what of song, of speech, of memory, passed from parent to child? These leave no record, yet they shape lives as surely as aqueducts or amphitheaters. Still, the mystery remains tantalizing. Why so few manuscripts? Why so little architecture? Why so uneven a record of coins, burials, pottery? Why do we feel the pulse of Rome so strongly, and the heartbeat of the later Middle Ages so vividly, yet stand in a hush between them? It is this silence, this almost deliberate seeming absence, that provokes whispers of cover-up. Perhaps rulers wish to erase rivals. Perhaps church authorities, seeking to shape narrative, copied selectively, preserving saints' lives while ignoring inconvenient chronicles. Perhaps war consumed not only people but paper, fire licking at the scrolls until history itself crumbled into ash. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same: a void. In that void, imagination thrives. We speculate about phantom emperors, invented centuries, manipulated calendars. We imagine monks hunched over manuscripts, editing out years or adding them in. We envision artifacts buried deliberately or destroyed to hide the past. Whether or not such conspiracies are true, the silence makes them possible. For silence is not neutral, it invites interpretation. It tempts us to fill it with our fears, our doubts, our stories. The Dark Ages may not have been silent to those who lived them, but they are silent to us, and in that silence lies both mystery and allure. Perhaps, then, the real cover-up is not in what was erased, but in how we frame the absence. By calling it darkness, we cast a shadow over a period that may have been vibrant in ways we cannot measure. By focusing on what is missing, we overlook what survives. The manuscripts painstakingly copied, the modest churches still standing, the oral traditions that seeded later epics. Silence does not always mean void. Sometimes it means music too subtle for our ears. Yet until archaeology uncovers more, until the earth yields further secrets, we are left with this haunting hush between two ages of grandeur. And in that hush we wonder, was history truly interrupted, or was it rewritten in ways we cannot yet see?